Morning everyone, my name is Stephanie Grant and I'm a Year 12 student at Wangaratta High School. Welcome to this evening's event, all about our community power. I would like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are all meeting today. Today I'm calling in from the land of the Pangrang people. I would like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. I would like to thank our expert panellists for this evening, Professor Kate Auty and Professor David Karoly. I would also like to thank Professor Tim Flannery and Dr. Helen Haines, who unfortunately could not attend tonight, but have made pre-recorded contributions. This event has been put together by Susan Benedyka, who is also stepping up as an independent candidate for the Victorian Senate. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to Susan. If you were to ask any young people for their biggest worldly concerns, climate change would certainly make the top of the list. As a young person who is not yet able to vote, my generation is dependent on others to vote for strong climate action now. What happens in the next few years will be critical for the protection of our planet and the lives of young people and future generations. But we also know that there are economic opportunities if Australia fully embraces renewable energy and emerging technology. Thank you all of you for attending, and thank you for the work you are doing in your communities in this space. In a few moments, we'll hear from some experts who have been working on this challenge for longer than I've been alive. But first, I would like to introduce Matthew Gordon, who will be running this evening's event and keeping an eye on the clock for us. Thank you, Matthew.
Very well said, Steph, and thank you very much for the warm introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm Matthew Gordon. I'm here to help run the show and make sure any technical issues or challenges that may arise are supported. I'll, in a moment, share with you my phone number. So if you have any technical issues coming up, please give me a call or use the chat function. So today we're going to hear from some wonderful minds and leaders across Australia. We'll kick off with some pre-recorded statements from Professor Tim Flannery and Dr. Helen Haines, MP member for Indi. We'll then go to a panel discussion hosted by Kate Auty with Susan Benedyka and David Karoly. We'll be opening up for a Q&A at around 7:40 this evening. So if you have any questions or statements or comments, please post those just to the chat function, and you'll find the chat function either above or below the Zoom webinar software. So just hit on chat, and then by the time we get to the Q&A, we'll be able to put your question directly to the panelists. Okay, so without further ado, let's kick this off. I'd like to share with you a pre-record of Dr. Tim Flannery and Helen Haines from yesterday, sharing their thoughts about community power and the future of Australia's energy systems.
We're in an interesting time in terms of addressing climate change, a really critical time. You know, the 6th assessment report has just come out, and that has sounded an absolute final warning for us that time is very, very short to get a large amount of work done. You know, whether we can stay below 1.5 degrees or not is still up in the air, but we know that we can limit the damage regardless of what we do, and we need to do as much damage limitation work as we can. I guess we started the heavy lifting back in October, November with the Glasgow Climate Summit. The world went some way at that meeting towards pledging to reduce emissions. I think that's been good. Subsequently, the situation in Ukraine, the war, has really underlined the absolute need in Europe to become free of fossil fuels. There's no doubt about that anymore. Everyone can see the need and they're working towards that. So we've seen some acceleration. Places like Australia, unfortunately, are not doing the heavy lifting that's required. You know, when I look around the world at constituencies that are very effective at climate action, they've all got a target and they work together in a united way. So what a target does is basically give everyone a job. So the ideal situation in Australia would be one where the federal government had set a target, the states take up part of the work to achieve that target, industry takes up part of that challenge, the economy in general, and civil society. And you see that model working beautifully in places like Scotland, where they set a very ambitious target. They achieved it 4 years ahead of the deadline. And that's because everyone felt engaged, everyone saw that they could contribute something. And so it worked right through society. I guess what I'm saying here as well, Matthew, is that, in the old world, the kind of top-down politics that we've got used to really works very well in a fossil fuel era. That sort of, the money is monopolised by a few, and you get an oligarchy, and power is concentrated in parties or a few individuals, and that's the way things are. In a new distributed world, it's very different. Everyone does their bit. Everyone has their independent or partially independent power source. This very time when it's absolutely essential to address climate change, we've got multiple challenges happening. We're seeing a shift in our politics from a very top-down hierarchical approach that has characterised Australian politics and global politics for a long time, through to a more distributed approach. In the fossil fuel era, I think, that top-down approach was powered by the monopoly that having fossil fuels would give individuals and countries. And we saw a very nasty form of politics, I think, through that period. But that is now changing. And what you see again and again as nations set targets to address climate change is that those targets empower everyone in society. So the government, the national government sets the target, the states or the provinces do their bit, industry does their bit, civil society does their bit, and individuals do their bit. And we all are empowered by achieving that great national goal. That system works very well where you have a better form of democracy as well, where there's more participative democracy, where there's a lot of give and take between the elected representative members and the rest of society. So, we are in a period of very, very dramatic change. I really just want to finish up, though, by reflecting that it's an absolutely critical period in human evolution overall, I think. There's no more dangerous moment in the life of an individual than the moment of birth. It's when you transition from a stable, steady environment into a totally new and more difficult environment. Well, we are seeing the birth of a new world, really, and young people understand this. We're seeing a world that's going from top-down monopolies in terms of energy and the way systems work, through to a new form of democracy, through to a new form of just being a citizen, having solar panels on your roof, having energy independence, becoming more engaged in the whole democratic process and in the life of your society. But it's a dangerous moment. It's one when we all need to pull together. We need better representation in Parliament than the old systems we've got. We need that energy independence, and we need to shift from fossil fuels with double quick time, because the next decade is going to be the absolutely make or break period. If we're not largely decarbonised by between 2030 and 2035, we're not going to make it. So I wish you well for the rest of your meeting. I know David Karoly and others are going to give you a great presentation and much more on climate change. So good luck with it. Thank you.
Here in Indi, we know that we're at the forefront of all of the perils that climate change can bring to us. We suffered the worst bushfires we've ever experienced over that black summer in 2020. Towong Shire up in the Upper Murray, which I represent, right through the Alpine region, absolutely smashed by those fires. We had smoke lingering across our magnificent grape crops through our regional towns for weeks and weeks and weeks, and we saw incredible damage to the hearts and minds of the people that I represent. That's one example of a devastating bushfire that we know we will see more of with greater intensity and greater frequency. We know that the magnificent agriculture, rain-fed agriculture that's so important to our economy is at risk. We know that our beautiful snowfields may no longer be there. if we don't act on climate. So here in a regional community such as what I represent, climate change is very real and acknowledged as something we need to do something about by most people that I represent. It's also seen as a tremendous opportunity. We know that when it comes to the production of renewable energy, regional Australia is where it's at. This is our greatest opportunity since the gold rush. We know that solar and wind is produced in regional Australia, and the opportunity for us in this inevitable transition is really, really bright if we get the policy levers right. So in meeting with people right across Indi, I had a very strong call from small communities and larger communities that we could really work together around what this transition might look like and how communities such as ours could take control of their energy future. There's a couple of elements to this. The first one is fundamental energy security. So communities like Euroa, right down in the southern part of my electorate at Indi, are right on the edge of the grid and frequently experience brownouts and blackouts. The same at the upper end of my electorate in the Towong Shire. Similar thing. A young journalist went to live there recently and a mother said, don't forget to pack candles because the power goes off there, you know. When it comes to security in times of natural disasters such as bushfires, we saw again during Black Summer that many towns in the Towong Shire and the Upper Murray, Corryong in particular, were without power for weeks. That meant that the hospital had to be evacuated. That meant that the fire station, that the police station, that the evacuation centre were all struggling for power and had to bring in generators. So we know that energy security is important. We know that community energy, that approach whereby communities generate and share both electricity itself and the profits that come from it is a really great opportunity. So we have some terrific case studies of communities taking control around their own generation of energy. Towns like Yakandanda, for example, and Euroa, and more towns like it now. So I set out to work with community to do something about this so that we could scale it up with good policy. I put together a discussion paper, sent that out around Australia. We had 100-odd submissions back into that. I set up a 15-member local energy panel of experts, and we worked together with those submissions and put together an entire policy platform, which we called the Local Power Plan. Here it is. You can go to my website, helenhaines.org, and have a look at it. In this plan, we put to government that we had 3 platforms that could really scale this up around Australia, that we could effectively have a distributed network of thousands of small energy generators in small towns, creating and sharing energy through sun, wind or wind. We know that in order to do this, we need to scale up our capacity to share our information and skills. So I put to government that we needed funding through ARENA to establish hubs, community energy hubs right around Australia. I put to government that we needed mid-scale energy generated and underwriting of that mid-scale, whereby local governments and private enterprise partner together, underwritten by government, and produce mid-scale energy is a real opportunity. And the final plank was putting forward an obligation that large-scale energy generation should ensure that everyday people in the local vicinity can truly benefit from that, whether that be by shares or whether that social construct to operate was improved. So we need to make sure that money that's being generated from renewables across regional Australia actually flows back into the pockets of regional Australians, that we have the opportunity to profit and that we have the real chance to have energy security. So the Local Power Plan was put together. I then drafted legislation called the Australian Local Power Agency legislation. Many people who participated in the co-design of the policy came to Parliament and were in the House when I read that into the House of Representatives. I then was successful in having that legislation investigated by a very powerful parliamentary committee, and a full report was tabled just in the last few weeks of Parliament, which highly commended the work. It didn't recommend that the legislation be passed, which is unfortunate, but it was a very complimentary report, and it actually called for ARENA being reviewed though, that there would be mechanisms to ensure that regional Australia truly benefits from this transition to renewables. So that work was really comprehensive. It really speaks to the way that I like to do politics, and I know the way that Susan would like to do politics, and that's not doing things to people, it's doing things with people, participating together in the design of public policy, having a strong, independent voice in the parliament so that those ideas, those policy platforms, these positive solutions to wicked problems can be put forward in the parliament and acted upon. So I'm taking both of those key platforms again to this election. I'm really keen to discuss ideas with people for policy solutions that can work. I hope that there'll be others getting on board with this as well. I know there's plenty of people getting on board with integrity, and I hope that any regional Australian will have a good look at these ideas around community energy. So thank you for the opportunity today. I hope this is a great panel discussion and lots of participation from the audience. I again congratulate Susan on her fantastic initiative here and wish her all the best and wish everyone listening all the best. Let's not step back from our democracy. Let's step right in and push for the change that we really want to see. Thank you.
Well, there you have it. A little round of applause for our pre-recorded talent. Our next presenter needs no introduction at all. Professor Kate Auty is the current chair of the Environment Protection Authority. She's an associate for the Melbourne Sustainability Society Institute. She's in the past been a sustainability commissioner. Kate Auty, I'd like to hand over to you now to begin a discussion with David Karoly and Susan Benedyka. Over to you now.
Thanks very much, Matthew, and hello, everybody. Thanks for giving your time to this really critically important discussion at this critically important time. That's really the first thing that I think we take from Tim's comments and also from Helen's. I'm coming in from Tangarong country. I just want to make sure that I acknowledge the elders past and present and all those young people who are coming up through the ranks and who will be the elders in the future. And I'd also like to do a bit of a shout out to you, Steph, for your wonderful introduction to us all tonight. So thank you very much for that. Very briefly about me, just for those who don't know anything about me, I was delighted to hear Helen refer to Euroa in her comments. Here in Euroa, we have been very actively on the community energy journey, if I can use that metaphor. We were part of Helen's development of the local power plan and very honoured to be involved and have our voice heard and be really part of that discussion with others, other local small towns around the northeast and the bigger cities. We are also here in Euroa very proud of our Euroa microgrid demonstration initiative. We've just signed off on that, and you'll find if you go and have a look at our Facebook site, Euroa Energy, the fact that Minister D'Ambrosio has congratulated us on what we've done. It is a representation of how things have changed. Here in Euroa, we are on the edge of the grid. Our councillors had always told us that that meant we were a bit of a basket case about energy. Lo and behold, of course, it is our best attribute. Things change, and certainly the energy discussion has. We're very fortunate here tonight to have Professor David Karoly talking to us, and we also have Susan, who has lent into this really critically important campaigning that's taking place over the next 6 weeks. About David, before we ask him to comment on the report that's just come out or on his work generally, some things about him, not all, because his CV is so long. He's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, and what an extraordinary honour that is, and it reflects David's status in the scientific community, particularly in climate change and earth science, earth systems. He's just stepped out of the role heading up the earth systems and climate change role in CSIRO, leaving that as recently as last year, as I understand it. David, correct me if that's not right. Prior to all of this, of course, you were a member of the Climate Change Authority between 2012 and 2017. But critically important for the discussion tonight, you've been an IPCC contributor over the better part of 2 decades, and that speaks to Steph's earlier comment about how long we've been having these conversations. 2001, 2007, 2014 and 2021. David Karoly, what are you telling us the targets, the big issues, the opportunities are? And I don't want to cut into what you might say, but I'll come back with some prompts, and we'll be inviting Susan to join us as well. What are the big issues, David? What targets should we be setting for ourselves, and how can we achieve them?
Look, thank you very much for the introduction, Kate. You and I have known each other for a long time and shared some platforms together, but it's a real honour to be asked by Susan to speak on this panel today. And what I'm going to do is give a 60-second summary of about 3,000 plus pages of the IPCC assessment. These scientific assessments of climate change take place every 7 years or so now. The science assessment had some really, really key conclusions. Not only that greenhouse gas concentrations are increasing, that temperatures have increased, that extreme weather events have increased, but it actually tried to put together what are effectively some, if you like, key messages. The first one is that every time there are additional emissions of carbon dioxide, global warming increases. And that's both a bad news message and a good news message, because every ton of carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels and from land clearing adds to global warming. But it also means that every time we don't emit from burning fossil fuels, we don't emit from burning coal, we don't deforest, we keep native forests and human managed forests standing, then we are limiting carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. And that's really, really important, because the other key message is, if we want to wait for natural processes to suck out the carbon dioxide that humans have put into the atmosphere, it will take 1,000 years or longer. It's a really, really long-term problem. I've used up my 60 seconds, but there are a couple of other additional messages, and this is on the impact report. More global warming means bigger impacts on human systems and on natural systems, from the increased risk of extreme weather events like heat waves, like bushfires that we've experienced already, like extreme rainfall. Every time there's more global warming, we get more extreme weather events. The really important conclusions for Australia is the worst emitter per person of carbon dioxide of all developed countries in the world. And the current government has done almost nothing to try to limit fossil fuel burning in Australia. The final message, critical for Susan, critical for the government, is a message in the key risks for Australia, and that is a current and future inability of institutions and governance systems to manage climate risks. And the people who've tried to live through the Black Summer fires, or who've tried to live through the floods in Queensland and in New South Wales, know that there's been an inability of institutions and governance systems to manage current and future climate risks. Those are the key messages.
Yeah, David, and look, in relation to those messages, just going to who's been talking about this over the decades, we know that the Defence Force, in fact, has produced reports about these matters. So it's also a security issue. And we're hearing a lot about security in the current discussions around this election. There's an awful big focus on that at the moment for the Pacific, amongst others, where people really are going to struggle with climate realities. The fact that you've been involved in so many of these reports, people often say, well, look, do we make people fearful? Do we give them hope? What do we do about people who feel despair? And we've got young Stephanie with us tonight. What's your message to people about how we can cope with those dilemmas, with that dreadful situation?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, because I've been described, and I think you know this as well, that I've been described as the scariest person at the University of Melbourne. And I'm just the messenger of the scary news. But it's critically important to recognise that we know what the problem is, we know how to fix it, and fixing it requires essentially transitioning as quickly as possible, and in fact, transitioning 10 years ago to a renewable energy-driven society. As Helen talked about, wind power and sustainable solar power are the opportunities for regional Australia to gain more jobs, to gain employment opportunities, and for young people to have careers in all of the things that are needed to manage a renewable energy-driven society. We have to move away from using fossil fuels. We have to move into a resilient, sustainable society. And that means transitioning to electricity power from solar power, from wind power, from tidal power, all of those sorts of renewable systems. And there are lots and lots of opportunities for regional development around those new opportunities.
David, the other thing, just before we ask Susan to talk about the regional situation, opportunities and challenges, the other thing just about targets, there's lots of messages out there, lots of messaging out there that can be quite confusing for people about the target we have to 2050, the target we don't have to 2050. Have you got some wisdom for people about what our target should be? What should we be aiming for? And I know we're saying 100%, but what should we be aiming for in a staggered sort of way?
Yep. Well, look, the simplest message is we need to get to zero emissions of carbon dioxide and other long-lived greenhouse gases in the atmosphere as quickly as possible. And we will only have stopped global warming when we go to zero, and that's zero globally. Another message from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is developed countries need to take the lead. That doesn't mean Australia has to wait till it's the last country to go to zero. It needs to be one of the leading countries to go to zero. Bottom line is we need to go to zero emissions before 2035 in Australia or early. We don't need a target for net zero by 2050 because global warming will have then exceeded 2 degrees. And that means if Australia is to take the lead, we need to be at net zero by 2035. We know that we'll be racing through 1.5 degrees of global warming. And essentially the final third part of the assessment report said that 1.5 degrees is pretty well impossible to limit global warming. All we can do is try to stop the level of overshoot and then suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through a range of approaches, including planting more trees, including any other technology solutions that allow us to stop global warming continuing and to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere.
Yeah, David, can I get you to reflect on, I'll just go to Susan, but can I get you to reflect when we come back to you on examples where we've seen good transition policies, because there are examples. But Susan, let's go to you about what this all means for people who are going to be considering who they vote for in the regions and who they vote for in the Senate. What do you think the opportunities are, and what do you want to say to the people who are here tonight?
I think there's two extraordinary opportunities, and both happen to be right in my bailiwick. So I've been doing regional development work for the best part of 40 years. And the opportunities that both Helen and David have spoken about, and Tim as well, in renewable energy and creating that future together is really important. And the other one's about community organising. What Tim was saying is that by setting a target, it gives us all an action to achieve, something that we can do. So there's different parts of the system, organising and activating and doing that work there. But equally, politicians like Helen and like myself in the Senate have got a whole role to play in the institution, the side that David said is really letting the team down. We've got to do the work that links people to policy, that clearly shows the way, guides the way, makes clear decisions, works across the Senate, in my case, so that it is not about tribalism, it's about how we come to really good agreements and that future. And then a role is to link people to the grants and the enabling work that can be done so they can work where they are. I just think it's vital that people think about independence, people who can get across the house, that are not beholden to one side or another or one ideology or another, but can actually talk across about how do we do this? Let's do this together. Let's make every opportunity count. So for me, it's that awareness that we do have power. We can make these changes. I love David's comment then about we actually know the problem and we know how to fix it, but we need to work together in order to create the solutions. And I'm probably going to quote you. Well, I am definitely going to quote you here, Kate, because you told me about a theory of change that you've been working to for a long period of time. And it's start where you are, organise, do the doing, whatever that doing has to be, and show what you did. And I love your Euroa example because you just started where you were. You knew you had this problem, so we start where we are. You organised as community, you didn't let it overcome you. And then you've showcased it, and what the work of the Minister has done has been even amplifying that further. This is within our power. We can do something. And I think that that's what we've got to take into account when we vote.
And the message about transition is a really interesting one, Susan, because of course there's all that good work that's been done in the Latrobe Valley by Karen Kane with the work that they brought together, where they brought together local, state and federal aspirations and actions. And there's a terrific community report out of that work, which I'd urge everybody to have a look at if we can get the link up. But David, going to the transition point that Susan makes and that we all think about, that point about organising and showing what we did and starting where we are. Have you got some examples or some guidance for people who are here tonight about what they should take away from this conversation about their capacities?
Yeah, look, the critically important things to think about are the ways that Susan is talking about communities, that Helen Haines has worked together. But, you know, examples include the way that, Kate, you and the people in Euroa led to the developments of this power grid that you talked about before. It's examples like the wind power system in the now I'm going to lose my thinking here, as one does with age, the wind turbine systems in the Hepburn's, yeah, the Hepburn wind system, which was developed now well over 10 years ago by community action and community engagement. And the only limitation on the electricity supplied by that system is that the network wasn't big enough, quick enough to allow the wind power being generated to feed into the system. So we've got to think about not only wind power and solar power, we've actually got to think about distributing that electricity efficiently over a larger, bigger network grid. It's community engagement that's critically important.
And fascinatingly, our friend Alan Pearce would of course be here saying to us, and also think about auditing what we do ourselves and our efficiencies. So that comes right back, Susan, in a circular way to your point, which is we can have big aspirations and big solar farms, but we've also got to think about our backyard. And that's what local politics is so powerfully bringing to the discussion. Is that something that you're really critically engaged with, Susan? I'm sure you are.
Absolutely. It's what drives me, Kate, again, in my work. It's bringing together people to solve solutions, to create solutions and solve problems. But I also know that there's still a role. So as I said, there's roles for everyone. The role of communities come together and do what can be done at a local level. You and David and Kate have pointed out that the transmission system is a major blockage. It's not able to take all of this distributed energy and get it moving around where we need to do it. That takes that political courage to get in there and advocate for that. So it's all levels that have to work together. One of my team, beautiful Kate, is going to put into the chat function a cartoon that we've had commissioned lately, just to say that as we are going on now, we have a limited time. The length of time of a senator is 6 years. Only half the Senate changes half the time. So we actually are not getting the big enough change we need to make those critical changes that David's talking about and the time confronting changes and challenges that Tim's talking about. So we've actually just put that in to say this has to happen now. If we want system change, we've got to do it this moment to create that bigger change that we want to see. So it's a long-winded answer, but yes, it's community, but everyone's got a part, and we've got to overcome all the parts of the system that are problems at the moment and make it an enabling system, not a limiting system.
Fascinating you make that point that there's a role for everybody, because David, I go back to when we ran the Euroa Environment Series in 2015 and we invited you to come up and speak to the very first one of those sessions. And a number of people here in the community thought that you probably wouldn't come because you were such a big shot. And there you were, you came up here to Euroa and you spoke to people on that Saturday and you were there for the whole day. And it was a great indication of just how committed scientists are to communicating what needs to be known about. We now need to work with engineers to get engineers to do some of the communicating, because they are extraordinarily a skill set that we don't all understand. So there's a role for communicators. And I was interested the other day hearing somebody talk about space travel, and the woman on the radio said what we need is some philosophers, because we need people to think about the ethical issues. Now that goes straight to your point, Susan, and to Helen's role and to all the independents. But it also goes to why you were so engaged with us, David. It's about being concerned about the ethics that underpin this extraordinary challenge for the next generation. And here we have young Steph with us tonight. Do you want to comment on those points about ethics and roles for everybody, David?
Yeah, look, I do. And I was actually talking to a new University of Melbourne subject called Today's Science, Tomorrow's World, which is compulsory for all science students, 3,000 students, about that and the critical issues of sustainability, of ethics, of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and that climate change is putting much at risk. I want to step back to the very beginning of this discussion and in the acknowledgement to country, because it is critically important to recognise that for thousands of generations, our country was managed sustainably. Yes, it changed, but it was managed sustainably by the traditional custodians of all the lands, of all the country, land country and sea country across Australia. And yet, within 200 years, European invaders have sacrificed much of the biodiversity, have sacrificed much of the land, and we need to make sure that we don't allow climate change to sacrifice the rest and our modern society. So in terms of ethics, let's think about fair ways of distributing the carbon allowance globally. And that's why we look at equal per capita emissions. Australia, if we take into account our exports of fossil fuels, is the worst country in the world per capita for internal and external exports of fossil fuel related materials and for fossil fuel related emissions in the country. We're worse than Saudi Arabia. We're worse than any country in the Middle East. We're worse than the United States. And the Australian government wants to make global warming worse because they want to support the fossil fuel industry. It's a crazy solution. The election should be based around choices, and the choice should be, do you want to solve climate change or do you want to make global warming worse? That's more than enough from me.
David, thank you. Thank you. Susan, we're going to go to other questions which Matthew's going to manage, but was there something you wanted to say about ethics and about those questions about roles for everybody before we do that?
Oh, I think it's fundamental, but it's also the ethics of how we live in society, how we treat each other. At the moment, the old system as defined by Tim Flannery has people with concentrated wealth and concentrated decision-making, concentrated power. He talks about a new system, which is much more distributed, like our energy systems, but that takes all of us thinking together about what that means for humanity. I love David's connection back to Indigenous, the way in which Indigenous people and First Nations have looked after this land. And that whole frame has got to be brought to this. And that means that we have to make principle-based decisions, not short-term transactional decisions on gains for individuals versus what we have to do as a whole society. And that's not just an Australian society. As David has also said, it's a global society. So there's a very deep ethical question here.
Matthew, we might leave it on that extraordinary note about the question of ethics, and I'll just do a bit of a shout out for the mountain pygmy possum, our own little endangered species up here in this part of the world, about which many people have put into many long hours to save it from extinction. And of course, while we're talking about engineers, we also need to think about those little critters. Back to you, Matthew, for the way in which you're going to manage the questions. Thank you, Susan and David. What an engaged conversation.
Thank you very much, Kate. Look, we've got a great number of questions coming through. What I might do is I'll throw to Steph, maybe to kick us off with our Q&A. Steph, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Matthew. I'd first like to say that that was a really interesting discussion, even from the standpoint of someone who isn't able to vote yet or isn't, you know, fully immersed in the political sphere, especially in terms of climate change. But I was really interested in hearing about the ethics of the climate change discussion and also of the despair, because I know that for young people, it's probably one of the most emotional elements of this issue is the despair and the anxiety that a lot of people feel. So I was wondering if you guys could speak on to what extent do you think it is a personal or individual dilemma, and to what extent individuals should take responsibility for the transition, and if from that, if there's any particular ways that we can take responsibility for that besides voting, especially as I'm not old enough to vote yet, what particular ways you think we should take responsibility for that? I know you did touch on it during the discussion, but I'd just like to hear more if you've got something to add to that. Thank you.
Let's throw it to you, David, to kick that off.
Sure. And look, I think there are lots of different ways. And Steph, you can talk to your friends, you can talk to your parents, you can talk to your neighbours who do vote, probably, or should vote. That's a way that you can influence, because expressing your views to a wider range of communities, and I know you're doing that by participating in this panel, that's a really important role for you. There are lots of other ways that individuals can play a role in addition to voting, and that is thinking about their own personal carbon footprint or greenhouse gas footprint. You can dramatically change that by thinking about how you travel, what sorts of things you do in terms of transport, in terms of food, in terms of energy systems in your home, in terms of insulation, in terms of how often you fly, how you travel interstate or you don't. And then finally, there are a couple of other really important things that people should think about, and that is how they invest their money, whether it's their superannuation and or their banking resources, because often people think about superannuation as a long-term investment. Yes, it is, but that long-term investment can and should be invested in environmentally and socially sustainable investments, rather than investing in fossil fuels. And unfortunately, a large number of the superannuation investment funds are going to ongoing support for the fossil fuel industries in Australia, like Adani or other major fossil fuel companies. So persuade your parents to think about their investments, about their homes, and what you spend your money on. Every new thing you buy uses materials and resources. Think about how that's been maintained and built.
Thanks, David. Susan, I might throw to you. You heard in Steph's question, the sort of the underlying anxiety, the sense of despair from young people. Obviously, there's some there's sort of the personal ethical decisions one can make about this. We can talk to our neighbours, we can convince the older generations that this is something to get behind. What do you have to say to young people who have got this kind of anxious feeling about the future?
It's actually pervasive. I hear it quite a lot, as I've been going around the state, and it's quite worrying. So my grandchildren range from 22 downwards. They've got that same anxiety. And the thing that gets them out of that is doing something. So actively working with a few others. It might be about a recycling initiative locally. It might be finding out more about how you can help in local conservation and local land management. Just get engaged. And I know that we're speaking to a very engaged audience here, but it's do something, know that you can go towards a direction. I loved the example that Tim Flannery gave earlier about in Scotland, everyone had a target. There is a power in knowing that you're working towards something that's bite-sized and achievable, and then you can get a win. And from that win, you build energy and get another win. And energy, that's a bad pun, but continue to build wins. It's start where you are, go back to Kate's notion. If you're feeling disempowered, work out where you can take some action that makes you feel good and contributes to a solution.
Thanks, Susan. We might go to some other questions now. A couple have come up about the accommodation of renewables in kind of within the grid, and this idea of what fixing the grid means. Also, I mean, obviously the people in Western Victoria are a little bit angry at the moment about proposed transmission lines that AusNet's putting through. The question there is, can we have smaller independent transmission networks that feed into distributed systems? David, wondering if you might be able to just talk us through just some of the kind of the technical points there around transmission and, the challenges we're going to have with people, social license, and all that sort of stuff. You're on mute.
First thing to admit is I was muted. So I'm back loud and clear again, I hope, but I'm not an expert on energy systems and I can't really comment in detail, except that what we do know is that distributed systems are critically important in allowing distributed energy generation to work. We need a much improved network. We have had for the last 100 years, very much a focused network from a small number of very, very large generation systems where the fossil fuel-based generators existed to transmit power across from one location and essentially a distribution. We need a much bigger networked system because that then allows the fact that in some locations there might be cloud on a specific day that might reduce the energy generation from solar power, but often you'll find that it's sunny in other locations or that it's windy in those locations. And the combination of wind and solar and tidal allows us to have a sustainable 100% 24 hours a day energy generation system. We don't have to switch off power when it gets dark overnight. We know that we can make a very effective distributed system, providing power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Thanks, David. And Susan, I'll throw to you again on this one as well. I mean, I'm wondering if you're hearing some of the challenges within communities about transmission, and obviously, what do you sort of see are the opportunities, for a more distributed energy system?
Actually, I'm going to use my time to pass it to Kate. I want, Kate, if you could talk about the microgrids and the serving local communities. It is one part of getting the solutions right. There will still have to be a major distribution system, but what can we do that's generated locally and used locally? So back over to you, Kate.
Okay, look, let me just give some examples, and I'm also not an engineer, so I'll be absolutely upfront about that. But I do note that David's reference to Hepburn Wind has come up again today more publicly, in that Hepburn Wind, notwithstanding their two great big wind turbines put together by community activity, are now going to be backed up, if there's a change in government, by a community battery. So everything is going to be required to we need to think about everything as systems rather than standalone opportunities or isolated responses. And when I say think of things as systems, there is, again, going back to your point, Susan, a role for everybody. There's a role for the scientists to give us the sort of critical information David just has. There's a role for the engineers to make sure that we are switched on to what needs to be done. There's a role for the people who are energy experts who aren't engineers, and there are a few of them. There's a role for the ethicists. And one of the things we did here in Euroa with our grant for this microgrid was we thought, okay, what can we do for the renters who live above the bakery? They weren't going to get anything out of what our original proposal was because they were renters and they weren't entitled, in inverted commas. We made sure that we had the money that we didn't use for community engagement turned into money that could be used to install solar power for those renters in those flats. And that required some lawyers to think about changing the contract. Now, when you start on these things, you never think that it's going to involve lawyers because everybody hates lawyers anyway. But let me tell you that there's a role for everybody. People's skill sets are barely scratched if we just start at if we just think it's tram tracks. So my point, Susan, to your interesting question and David's interesting answer to that question as well earlier, is that we need to club together. And that's what you're doing with your candidature, and that's what Helen's done. That local power plan that Helen's put together, we were very pleased to be part of the expert group that came to speak to that. And I can tell you that when I spoke to a local person here who was involved in logistics about being an expert in respect of that plan, she said to me, but I don't know how to do the energy the engineering that goes into energy, but she knew how to do other things, which was to talk to business, to bring them together flexibly, to think about how you could share opportunities, and then to go back to them and say, look what we did and how clever are we? And that brings me to the final thing I'd like to say, and it goes to Steph's question. Steph, when we say start where you are, organise, show what you did, the most important thing you can almost certainly do is show what you did. If you looked at what we used to use to communicate, we had fax machines that you can't even envisage any longer. That was, you know, the height of technology. You have everything, Instagram, Facebook, which you probably don't use, TikTok. I'd be saying to every young person that you're talking to, use everything you can to tell your story. And we know we've been bad at doing it, and we know that we've been sold a pup because the others who do tell that story from fossil fuel world have in many respects not been doing good communication either. Let's just be better at it, and we can be, and I trust you, Steph. I'm on your shoulders.
There you go, Steph. No pressure at all there. I've got time for maybe two more questions, and we sort of touched on this topic already. But John Thompson has put a question. You know, we've got a large number of foreign companies moving into our energy market here in Australia. They're usually non-Australian companies sending their profits overseas. They have considerable power and commercial influence. That, you know, they obviously would have relationships with important people in government. But on the other hand, we've got the growth of these usually small community initiatives sort of trying to operate and sometimes compete in that same environment. What will ultimately be the relationship of these two sorts of enterprises? Kate?
I don't think I should answer this question. I think this actually should be one that goes to the politician amongst us, Susan. I think this is a question about how you get the big end of town to talk to the little people. And when we took our tape off to the COP in 2015, we called it Little Talks to Big, and we said that that was what we thought we needed to get good at. And that's what I think the independence movement is telling us as well. So I'll throw back to Susan, if you don't mind, Matthew.
And I'm really happy to take this one on. I've done some consulting work for some large international renewables companies who have bought into regional areas. One of the companies I worked for, I have a high value on their ethics, and they worked with community. So instead of just saying we've got a community bundle of money to give you, it's in New South Wales, so they are obligated to give community benefit. They said, what would that look like and how would that work and how do you get benefits out of this and how do we work together to make this happen? There was extended consultation. So it was not just consultation for the sake of getting an approval. It was meaningful, extended consultation. So in Helen's power plan, she talks about the large players in the system and that they have to be obligated to work with community. So that little talks to big, that really makes sense. The other thing is that I have seen, not the legislation, but seen the intent of practices overseas, particularly in Scandinavia, where in fact communities do work with those large companies and they own a share of what comes out of it. So they're actually remunerated as communities for the power that's generated, and there's an agreement that's established. And that really gives them a much bigger say in what's going on. So again, it's not tokenistic. It actually has to be meaningful, and we've got to work systems out like that. And I think the funding that Helen was talking about, arena funding coming into the system, starts to give some resources to create the conversations we need to have. We're designing new systems. We're designing a new way of thinking, and we've got to have a different way of doing things. And that's part of that community participation. We've got to own what matters to us, and we've got to really be part of shaping it. It means we can't give a license away and just say, you do that and we'll complain. We've actually got to buy in to create the solutions.
Thanks, Susan. Now we've got time for maybe one more question before we close out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple of questions from the Q&A function and see if I can kind of splice them together. One relates to where the Labor Party's at. They're paralysed. They're sort of struggling to kind of differentiate on climate policy. You know, what might break this habit? And in answering that question, Susan, when you it says here, if you get into government, but when you get elected, what kind of pressure will you put on the government of the day to declare a climate emergency?
I think that's a first statement that says we actually see the issue. We see it, we name it, we call it. You have to do that in so many other parts of life, is to name what's going wrong. That declaration then has to cascade to, we know we've got a climate emergency, now what do we do about it? And is our response appropriate to the level of emergency? If we just say it's something for another day, we don't give it the time or the effort or the really extraordinary work that's got to be done. So yes to climate emergency. The role of an independent is work across the House. We've seen extraordinary work done by Cathy McGowan, all the crossbenchers at the moment. Helen is a particular exemplar. And I think we've seen some brilliant work done by Jackie Lambie and by Rex Patrick in the Senate. And we need more of those voices, people who are prepared to go and sit beside the Labor Party or sit beside the coalition and say, here's another perspective. How do we craft a solution together? That's actually why I love the Senate. A lot of the work is done in good inquiries outside of the argy-bargy of the chamber, where the work gets done. And that's my role. And, you know, as a facilitator, you've known me many years, Matthew, that's what we have to do. We have to bring people together, find the common ground. So what's our vision? What's our target? And how will we get there? Regardless of what we've come into the room with, let's craft something together to get to that end.
And can I add something, Matthew? Because, I mean, it has been clear that for the last 9 years, while we've had a Liberal National Party government, there's been no impetus to actually change the views. The really only reason why the Liberal National Party has started to think about zero carbon targets or zero emission targets has been because of the role of the independents in the Senate and the independents in the lower house, and the growth of the independent view and the, if you like, disruption to the two-party system is only because of the success of the election of independents and the role that the minority parties, like Labor when it had a partnership with the Greens or others, the role of the independents has become critically important in getting a community view heard more loudly and blocking out the view of big business or the fossil fuel and media lobbies.
I think just to add on to that, it also goes to integrity. So I was on a national integrity panel yesterday, a national integrity forum, and it's about getting money out of the system, transparency about lobbyists, looking at ministers' diaries and knowing who's going to see them, who's in their ear, and where their donations are coming from. All of that has contributed to this gridlock of fossil fuels getting subsidised to an obscene extent, when that is not what we want for the future. So all of these, as Kate was saying earlier, it's a system. We've got to get all parts of the system working together properly.
Thank you, Susan. Now, we're just on time now, so I'd just like to thank everyone for their participation, and including our audience for taking the time out to spend some time listening to these issues and questions and concerns. I must say it's an absolute pleasure working with a group of smart, clever, passionate people, leaders who are on the right side of history. And before we wrap up, Susan, I'm going to throw to you to wish us off well.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the panellists. It's been extraordinary that you've taken your time to be here, and for Tim, Flannery and Helen in their amazing schedules. Matthew, I'd also like to thank you. You've done this as a very deep favour for me, and I really appreciate that. You've done that beautifully. Steph, what a delight to have your introduction and your perspective. And long may it rain, you know, that fresh thinking and being able to be engaged in conversations. So we need to pull together for better representation. We need to have disruption in the system. We need to have independence in there. Think really carefully about how you vote and what you do. Steph, you asked that brilliant question about how do we take action. You can take action, you can influence others to take action. My website is susanbenedyka.com, and you'll be able to find a whole lot of material on there. Sign up, fund this whole campaign so we can get in and make the changes that we need to see in government. Thanks very much.
Thank you all, and good night.